of Korea Working Group at the Kennedy School of Harvard University. He's been a long-time Korea watcher in DC and the United States, and now he's going to present his own view. Please welcome Dr. Zhao.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the organizers for having me here today. If there's one thing that I would like you all to remember from my talk, I know it's been a long day, is diagnosis. So keep that in mind. The question for session 3 is, what is the future of international security in Northeast Asia? What I'm going to do is paint the macro picture and then go into the micro aspects of this. And there are going to be 3 segments to my talk. The first is, there is the chronic challenge of missing chronic diagnosis in policymaking. Another way to say this is that, in my experience briefing policymakers, there is this dominant pattern where the diagnosis is either absent or outdated. In the second piece, it's a 2-part assessment here, looking with a focus on part A question, what's a diagnosis with respect to the security changes in Northeast Asia? And a part B question, what are the implications of this diagnosis? The sources of this are the key findings derived from my interaction in recent Track 1.5 dialogues, and I'll explain a little more what those are. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up with a mini case study of the puzzle, as Steve Miller has mentioned. The puzzle here in specific is North Korea Incorporated. This is the elite 1% North Korean state trading companies. Their growth amid increasing sanctions. That is a really inconvenient fact. And here, looking very specifically, the unintended consequences of using this main non-proliferation tool. And I want you to keep in mind the story of antibiotics and superbugs, because I think there's some direct correlations here. So to begin with, this is something that I wanted to bring to the attention of the group. If you use a medical analogy here, the medical approach is a 3-part approach. The first part is diagnosis. This is where medical professionals try to establish causation. What is causing the illness? There's about 70% of time and effort, ballparking it, in terms of this first very critical stage. It's based upon the key findings of this stage. You see medical professionals develop treatments. Option A, option B, pros and cons, and so forth. And then finally, whatever time and effort remaining, you're looking at monitoring. Now, if we were to think about what is the comparable if we look at the policymaking process, a quick pop quiz. So to the group and to the audience, just raise your hand. If you think the first phase, diagnosis, policymakers spend 25% of their time and effort, show of hands, really high. Wow, okay, 50%. Those who think 50% of time and effort of policymakers. And then 75%, those who think that policymakers devote 75% of their time and effort to diagnosis, to understanding what's causing a particular policy crisis. Show of hands. Not much. Well, if you kind of break this down, what ends up happening is that the policymaking approach, there's a jump immediately into policy implementation. This is a function, and I'm very sympathetic to this. Policymakers, and in many respects, people on National Security Council, their equivalents, they're confronted with a crisis. They literally park all other issues to the side, and that becomes the dominant focus of any given administration. So with this, you're looking at the bulk of time and effort immediately thinking of a carrot or a stick. When things don't go according to plan, this is where they do retroactive diagnosis. So this idea of, in the case of Washington, this is where they call in the think tank experts, either former government officials or subject matter experts. It's over breakfast or lunch. And they lay it out very clearly. Our goal was this. We thought this would work. It's not working out. What are your thoughts? This is a retroactive policy analysis, a retroactive diagnosis. Now, the remaining time, you see policy monitoring and an effort to try to deal with the different elements and try to tweak and whatnot. When I brought this methodology and this sequence to medical professional friends, and I said, if this were a patient, if the policy were a patient, what would the health outcome be? They uniformly said death. The patient would die. So I think this is important to put into context because, again, I'm sympathetic to those in the policymaking roles as you're confronting a crisis, but there is an overwhelming tendency, not to say that this happens all the time, but in dominant number of cases, you see this immediate jumping to carrot and stick and how to deal with the crisis at hand. So moving to the second part, I wanted to look at this idea of what's the diagnosis as we're looking at the security changes in Northeast Asia. And framed a little differently, the focus that I zeroed in on is how are the core actors reacting to the Panmunjom Declaration and the Singapore Summit. These are the key current efforts to realize nuclear-free Korean Peninsula and also promote global peace and prosperity. Now, the frame that I'd like to use is a quote in international relations where don't let a good crisis go to waste. And if you look at it from that lens, as Steve mentioned with his opening remarks this morning, he looked at the first of 6 factors about the differing perceptions of the threat, and hence the longevity of some of these puzzles. Here I'd like to shift it slightly different, same kind of logic, but look at the different perceptions of the opportunity. So if we look at the current predicament, we're looking at political, as we've seen and heard from the different presentations, the difference between a political versus a technical process. We're still very much in a dominant political process where the two leaders, the respective leaders, are trying to create the space for a diplomatic engagement to work. And in creating this critical space, you're looking at other key actors leveraging their space to basically maximize their national interests. In the case of North Korea, they're switching gears from nuclear weapons development to the economy. So it's particularly the economy and trade, and in this case, trade with China. Now, it's creating its optionality by leveraging these gaps in the US's nuclear negotiations game plan. And North Korea now is directly engaging China. And I'll go into more detail how that's playing out and what the implications are, but also directly engaging with South Korea. There is zero consistent coordination among these actors in dealing with North Korea right now. South Korea, if you viewed last year as the year of maximum pressure, as a lot of my South Korean colleagues were very worried about, it was also the time period of Korea passing, the sense that the US administration's focus on military as well as economic pressure and maximum pressure was putting us in a trajectory where conflict, the probability of it was increasing dramatically. So for South Korea, the idea of don't let a good crisis go to waste is using the current situation to gain more control of its fate over the Korean Peninsula. And so with this, the idea of what eventually became the culmination of this effort, the Panmunjom Declaration, we're basically seeing an effort to use these inter-Korean projects to get more of that control over its fate and destiny on the Korean Peninsula. For China, I would argue that this is a golden opportunity to advance what I frame as Beijing sunshine policy with Chinese characteristics. This is an ongoing game plan. This is not something new. It is certainly something through the party-to-party dynamic, Communist Party of China to Workers' Party of Korea relationship, where the analysis is very, very thin. So to the fellows, the research fellows and the summer fellows, this is a very important topic to better understand. The underestimation and overestimation of this relationship, I think, just screams out more research. But with respect to this, clearly we're not seeing the Chinese leadership lifting sanctions, but they are in practice easing up on the implementation of sanctions. This is an area where in creating that additional political space between the two parties, there's been a lot of movement. And particularly if you look at it through the lens of the 3 summit meetings between Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, President Xi and the Chinese leadership does not do summitry like the US. It's not summit first and then figure out a deal later on. I guarantee you there are things that have been concluded and hence this summit. And so trying to unravel that is a critical element here. Looking at the part B part overall of what are the implications of this diagnosis, first let me say that change has already been going on in the region. It's not a function of new change. The question specifically here is what's different now? There are 3 factors. One is the rate of change. It's much faster. If you look at how things are playing out in terms of North Korea's nuclear ballistic missile development, the implementation of sanctions, these different summits, the cycle is extremely fast. It feels like background noise now, it feels normal. But if you look at it in terms of the time scale of this ongoing crisis, it is not a normal pace. The second factor is this increasingly interconnected nature of this region. So in the real world, there are not many silos. In research methodology, because of our respective disciplines, there are a lot of silos. And so when you look at it, there are some natural gaps that we have to be cognizant of. And the third factor is this missing diagnosis. What I mean here, the chronic challenge that we still deal with because policy continues to be based on deficient or outdated diagnosis. This is really a call to arms to the new generation of researchers. You're going to have different sectoral experiences, you're going to have different tools. When you see something, as they say with respect to a lot of public space in the United States, say something. When you see something, say something. If you see a gap, say something. And this idea that your observations are as legitimate as anyone else's because of the changed landscape. Let me highlight one kind of quick update on the diagnosis here. In the United States, as some of my senior colleagues have mentioned in recent Track 1.5 dialogues, there's a lack of the 3 Ps. And we're seeing this in different sectoral functional spaces. My senior colleagues were referencing US trade policy. What they meant by the lack of the 3 Ps, a lack of process, a lack of policy, and lack of priority. In many respects, I think we're seeing something similar in dealing with North Korea. You have a summit, and then you have the lack of the 3 Ps. This is not a concerted, coordinated game plan. This is, as events happen, very reactionary. Now, as it relates to this question of what are the implications of the diagnosis, I wanted to zero in on the US-China relationship. Clearly we're seeing now the connection between security and trade. It doesn't feel like it. It feels like a phony war, but there is a trade war, a major trade war between the United States and China that's escalating. The threats are out there. We haven't seen the actual big fire shot. There have been small shots fired across the bow here. But what's misleading is that the metrics are not aligned. So the US stock market right now is performing exceptionally well. But if you look at the cause of this, it's not a function of the different sentiment that the trade war isn't serious. The United States, the US companies are announcing and reporting record earnings. After the financial crisis in the United States, American companies are doing well. They've benefited off of monetary policy where money was very, very cheap. They could do a lot of type of business expansion under very advantageous situations. So the metric, another way to think of it is the tailwind of earnings is much stronger right now than the headwind of tariffs. But that's sentiment. That's not really factual. If you look at what's on tap in terms of what could be the subject of tariffs between the United States and China, the US administration view is that this can be surgical, that you can take a scalpel. But if you look at it, there will be many countries affected, in particular if you look at South Korea. South Korea trades intermediate goods both to China and the United States. So if you look at the value chain, the old diagnosis that you could do some kind of trade tariff type of action, in this integrated type of situation, and particularly with this idea of outdated diagnosis, it's a very, I think, dangerous period right now. So looking at this part of how I dial it back and related to this idea of North Korea, this trade war between the United States and China is creating critical space for North Korea to exploit further this space to its advantage. Why is that the case? And that's largely because the United States is unable to coordinate closely with China, which has traditionally been this foundational prerequisite piece for any effective nuclear negotiation. So stated differently, US-China coordination is a necessary but not sufficient condition, but we don't even have that coordination to begin with. So that creates, again, this very advantageous situation for North Korea. The other piece of this is, if you look at it, North Korea is using this from its perspective in Pyongyang to make more inroads with China. And what I mean here isn't courting Chinese investment in North Korea. There are many, many analysts looking at what's changing in the North Korean economy. Rather, what I'm talking about is the 1%, the North Korea Inc. regime elements migrating into the Chinese marketplace further and expanding their operations. Now, finally concluding on this section, looking at the China-Korea Peninsula relationship, we have to break that out. China doesn't have a standalone South Korea policy, doesn't have a standalone North Korea policy. But if we do look at those two pillars of their overall Peninsula strategy, what we see is, in the case of the China-South Korea relationship, that case is a very important case study. If you think of this whole debate about the effectiveness of economic coercion, let there be no doubt the Chinese economic coercion on South Korean companies in the Chinese marketplace, extremely effective. We know this because the Lotte Group companies in China literally threw in the towel and they put up their assets for sale. They just couldn't compete anymore. And so when you look at these type of non-tariff measures, during the Park Geun-hye administration, the trade lawyers were tasked with, can we build a case to bring it to the WTO? And the legal assessment was there's not enough there. These are very ad hoc type of measures, very difficult to find that evidentiary basis. We are going to see these practices, if we continue on this trajectory on the US-China trade war, of these measures applied to US companies in the Chinese marketplace. Now, to look at the angle of China and North Korea, this is, I think, a story of the rebuilding of the Communist Party of China, North Korean Workers' Party of North Korea Workers' Party relationship. So there are some key elements here. The legacy of the 1992 China-South Korea normalization. It's a long chapter. That is, in many respects, a huge shock for the North Korean regime. The carpet was pulled out from underneath them. And that was a huge victory for South Korea. At that time, South Korea's northern policy of reestablishing the power balance on the Korean Peninsula in South Korea's favor, using South Korea's soft power. In the early 1990s, South Korea was a superpower when it came to soft power. It was a darling of the international community in terms of this rapid industrialization, and it had legitimate things to offer China in this grand bargain, where China, in return for South Korean investment, trade credits, China basically reoriented fundamentally its relationship with North Korea. And you got to think about this context. You have the Soviet-North Korea relationship in the late 1980s, and then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that pillar collapsing. And then finally with the China and North Korea pillar, North Korea is on life support. There's a lot of rich analysis here also, because the conventional research in this area is a story of U.S.-North Korea negotiations in the Clinton administration. But I think in terms of North Korea's observing of the situation and the idea of putting all the eggs in the nuclear basket and cranking out plutonium at Yungwoo also has a China dynamic in terms of the legacy of this time period. So here, if you look at it from a Chinese game plan, there is an ongoing effort for China to rebuild the economic prosperity that really has been very elusive in the Yungwoo region, the border with North Korea. So this isn't a function just of strategic considerations or improving relationships with North Korea. It's also a story of trying to catalyze that sub-regional economic development zone so you get a sustainable growth in the Chinese provinces. Running out of time, I'm glad to discuss it in more detail, but let me just zero in on key findings from a research project that my colleague Jim Walsh and I looked at. And we essentially looked at the accumulated learning of the North Korean regime in evading sanctions, because the implications of that are very profound. First part, we know that sanctions have become the dominant policy tool in dealing with proliferation. If you look at sanctions, they've become the antibiotics of international security. For the United States in particular, if there's any foreign policy challenge in a security crisis, the first tip of the spear response isn't depending on it's the Treasury Department. If you look at the team that designates and applies U.S. sanctions on particular targets, it truly is this idea of the antibiotics. Now there's this thinking that increase the dosage, better outcome. But as I'll show in a little bit, what we're seeing is drug resistance. In the case of the North Korean regime, I would argue that certain elements of the North Korean regime is a superbug, that it has encouraged this migration into the Chinese marketplace and introduced some drug resistance that is very, very problematic for the non-proliferation community. The research in this field is dominated by the sender bias. If you're a national government, you're the one who usually writes up the reports, public dissemination. And as my colleague Jim Walsh says, that it's almost like a doctor evaluating his or her performance on the number of prescriptions they write, as opposed to health outcomes of patients. This is where we're at. If the Treasury Department is applying sanctions, then that policy is an A+. It's a very subjective type of metric. What's missing is a target perspective. But what we're really lucky about, in South Korea, there are 30,000 North Korean defectors. Of that, there's an elite group with a very specific experience of having worked in North Korean state trading companies, of having been North Korean corporate officials. Very simple way to say that, these are North Korean businessmen. And the deals and the activities that they did in the Chinese marketplace reveal a lot, not in terms of the direct national security implications, but just the nature of how they do business. So Jim and I adopted a business school case study approach, qualitative research, looking at their business practices, their partners and pathways, part A, and then in part B, look at the national security implications. So let me conclude with the last slide here, if we could go to the very end. So graphic representation of this inconvenient fact of the puzzle. North Korea got better with their procurement as we applied more and more sanctions, UN Security Council sanctions or Treasury ones. So the final slide, you just go back. I just wanted to highlight some of the key findings. One is this idea of the monetization of risk. In the marketplace, if actors can figure out how to price things, again, that's very bad news for us, very good news for them. The application of more sanctions on North Korean targets, and Adam's going to talk more about this in his talk tomorrow, but this idea that rather than scaring off intermediaries, any China local companies that have local hookups with local corrupt party officials, law enforcement, and so forth, they're essentially renting out their networks. And this idea of seeking out North Korean clients, knowing that they're the subject of sanctions, but rather than being scared off by that, using that as justification to charge higher commission fees. North Korean regime, flush with cash from the sale of coal in the second half of the 2000s, global commodity price peaks. They're more than able to finance this kind of proliferation. The other finding is this idea that these aren't business trips. These aren't North Korean incorporated officials going to China, business deal coming back. They're embedded. Now, from a business perspective, being embedded in a local marketplace, your tacit knowledge of how to do business skyrockets. Learning curve is tremendous. So rather than the old days of North Korean procurement agents going abroad, in many cases being exploited, being ripped off, or being sold the type of components that half of it's delivered, half of it's not, the sophistication, they understand the local marketplace much better. And as it translates into the overall business activities, the majority of the North Korean procurement in this particular instance is benign. But what I argue is that when you develop this type of commercial channel, that in of itself constitutes a dual-use technology, if you define technology as an application of knowledge. So with this, I wanted to conclude with the following questions for further discussion, hopefully over dinner and so forth. The first is, how has the application of sanctions delayed Korean unification? There are many pieces to that. The second is, what would be the impact of U.S. application of secondary sanctions on Chinese companies? President Trump recently said the stalling of the U.S.-North Korea talks is due to China. And so this idea of if you're going to apply tariffs on China, why not apply secondary sanctions on Chinese companies that are doing business with banned North Korean entities? But the impact in terms of the respect to the future of international security in Northeast Asia is pretty profound if the U.S. goes that route. And then finally, the last question I'd like to leave you with is, what are the unintended consequences of U.S.-China trade war on non-proliferation efforts in Northeast Asia?
Thank you very much. Originally, this session was supposed to end by 5:30. We are quite behind the schedule already. But if organizer is okay, I'd like to have a couple of minutes of Q&A if there's still some burning question from the floor. Yes, please.
Quan Chief van Kaina. My question goes to Chinese.